Alright, if you want to hear more of that, you know where to find it. Hey, we're back. I will be talking about a video that I found online, and it's talking about the Greekness of the Macedonians, made by this guy called Metatron. That's also the name of his channel. I'll put it back in the description. I'll put it in the description of this video, so that you can take a look at that video. He has a great channel, guys. Don't get me wrong. I love that guy. He's a Christian. I'm a Christian. I love my fellow Christian brothers and sisters. But you know, the Metatron channel, let me put it this way, it deals with interesting topics, and he's organized when he speaks about a matter. That doesn't necessarily mean that he is always right. It doesn't necessarily mean that he's always right. Now, let me introduce that channel to you. It will be this channel. If I can just introduce them to you. It's this guy right here. And as I mentioned, this guy, I like him. He does great videos. You can guys check him out. But this video, I think he disappointed. He disappointed big time, I think. And for reasons that we're gonna get into. So you can watch that video in the back while I'm talking about things. Now, the Metatron channel deals with interesting topics, as I mentioned, and is organized when he speaks about a matter, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's always right. You know how they say, if one speaks in a British accent, he or she is not necessarily smart. Same goes with if someone is presenting to you something in an organized manner, it doesn't follow that they are right. However, the point of this video will be not to convince you, but to give you a different perspective so that you can make up your own mind. With that said, Metatron tried to do a deep dive about the Macedonians, but it seems that he only repeats the interpretation of one side of the story without even going to what the other side has to say, especially if that other side, a whole nation, millions of people, us Macedonians, fought and died and created a country after the Second World War, much like the Jews after 2 millennia. Now, we call ourselves Macedonians, but let's go on. He starts with giving historical evidence, and then he infers his opinion based on interpretation of ancient sources and contextual data analysis. He tries to argue about the legitimacy of the inclusion of the Macedonians in the Hellenistic world. Spoiler alert, he thinks Macedonians were Hellenes, but including them in the Hellenistic world, by the way, when you say Hellenistic, it means that they were something other than Hellenes. You would have said Hellenic. So that it would, if you say Hellenistic, it would imply that they superficially, out of political gain, included parts of Hellenic culture, precisely what the Romans did. Yet he never, in his sane mind, says that, the Romans were Hellenes. Not even that they were Hellenistic, which they were. He mentions that this study will adapt to a multidisciplinary approach, but out of all things, he forgot to take propaganda of the ancients in mind and filter through it. I personally think his based opinion, his biased opinion on this matter kind of got the better of him. Let me show you what I mean. Stick around. This will get even more interesting, guys. He starts talking about how he conducts his presentation while giving subliminal messages of ancient Macedonian coins with so-called Hellenic script. Basic thing that anyone dealing with European history should know, especially if one claims to go deep as Metatron does, is that the Hellenes, or whoever lived in the Balkans at that time, Pelasgians, wink wink, received that script from a Phoenician named Cadmo. Many of those Macedonian coins, with, I would say, Koine Phoenician script, end in the letter Y. This letter in Phoenician is pronounced as vo or vowel. So when you read Alexandroi ending in Y, It could be pronounced Alexandrovo, which even in modern Macedonian is the same way of pronouncing something that belongs to someone by adding vo. In this case, the coin belongs to Alexander. Just keep this in mind, we'll come back to this later. He will go on to say that 3 key things to talk about when it comes to identify the Macedonians are language, culture, and territorial ties. Sure, we'll go with that. Alright, now, he will go on to say that there are 3 key things to talk about when it comes to identify, as we mentioned, language, culture, and territorial ties. But before that, really quickly, I want to thank you for sticking around, and if you want to support me, there are a couple of ways of doing it. Either like it, subscribe it, share it, or just grab a shirt from one of our shops that I will have a link in the description below. Alright, so the ancient speak is the first section of this guy's video, and the host of the channel that claims the Macedonians were Hellenes in this video starts with one of the earliest mentions of Macedonian people by Homer, which you saw on the screen. And those are the Paionians living near the river Axios, or Vardar, as we call it, which means white gift. He also mentions the land Ematia, which means is mother, which is, and there's a deliberate purpose, or I'm deliberately mentioning all these translations to you guys for reasons that you're gonna notice later on. Ematia, or is mother, is a synonym of the name Macedon, which in some Macedonian dialects have mater, which is Matia, and some Make, which is mother, or from Macedon. But then he skips this most early source, like it's nothing, when in fact he should have used his logical capabilities to come to the best logical explanation of who those people were, the Paionians, in this context, and how they tie to the Macedonians, and do this more, let's say, deeply. If you followed my channel so far, you would have noticed that the ancient Macedonians, per the most recent monumental scientific discovery of deciphering the middle text of the Rosetta Stone as ancient Macedonian Slavian language. Slavian means nothing but glorious, it's not ethnicity per se. Macedonians worshipped a very old, very ancient deity, prevailing from the Neolithic even, and that is the Great Mother deity. Ematia, Make, you get it. They were calling themselves as Detsa Mo, or Detsa Namodea, or children of the Great Mother, as it is read in the stone, in the middle text. The very name Ematia, as I mentioned, means is mother. Furthermore, the ancient Macedonian word for up was pa, found in the text, as read in the stone as well. And we've seen over and over again how the Macedonians refer to themselves in the stone as Yunza, meaning young bulls, even in modern Macedonian language. So when we say Pa Ionia, we are talking about Upper Ionia, or the upper land of the young bulls. It is a historical fact that Macedonia, for the lack of a better term, was divided into Upper and Lower Macedonia. Something that many scholars talk about, and one of them was Peter Green from Oxford as well. Now, Metatron goes on to say that Hesiod implicitly says that Macedonians are of Hellenic stock by being related to the Aetolians, but Herodotus claims that they weren't of Aetolia stock, yet Metatron never addresses this inconsistency. He just neglects it. Nevertheless, he claims that Herodotus didn't have any doubts that the Macedonians were Hellenes. It's interesting when Metatron cites Herodotus' book First 56, there was never a mention that the Macedonians were Hellene, only that they were known by the name Dorians. Given that the Macedonian words, even per mainstream, the ancient Macedonian words per mainstream scarcely exist, they alone, let alone sentences and texts, we cannot infer that Doric Hellenic texts were Macedonian texts, if you want to be precise. Doric, concerning Macedonians, then, implies only as a territorial identification connected to a distinct ethnicity, namely Macedonians. To say it otherwise, to put it in Metatron words, would be insane. Herodotus here does mention that Macedonians lived near Olympus, then they expanded to Peloponnese. Keep that in the back of your mind for a minute, we'll come back to that later. But before that, let's wrap up this segment by giving the other side's interpretation, something that Metatron never did. So, first of all, whenever we see inconsistencies, we should be suspicious and examine things more, let's say, more deeply. Now, one record shows that Macedonians were of Aetolian stock, then another contradicts it. Seems like any other people not being Macedonian could tell us what Macedonians were or were not, but the Macedonians themselves. Well, we have something that could intrigue you, especially if you want to research things more, let's say, deeply. When confronted by the Roman general, Flamininus, to leave whole of Greece, implying Macedonia wasn't a Hellenic land, the Macedonian king Philip V answered him in a way where he didn't even understand what Greece was, adding that the Aetolians themselves, among others, weren't Greeks. Here's what Philip V of Macedon had to say about this. Now, this is from Polybius, one of the ancient sources that Metatron himself mentions, but contradicting Metatron. So here's what Philip V of Macedon responds to the Greek and Roman demands. But what is most outrageous of all is that they, meaning the Greeks, should attempt to put themselves on the same footing as the Romans and demand that the Macedonians should withdraw from the whole of Greece. To such language is arrogant, to use such language is arrogant, even in the first place. But while we may endure this from the Romans, it is quite intolerable, coming from the Aetolians. In any case, he continued, what is this Greece which you demand that I should evacuate? And how do you define Greece? Certainly, most of the Aetolians themselves are not Greek. The countries of the Argai, the Apodotea, and the Aphilochians are not regarded as Greek. This is what Philip V said. So do you allow me to remain in those territories? Ironically, Philip V asks the Roman general Flamininus. Other sources distinguish Macedonians from Hellenes, or at least they break up the propaganda's lie that things are that simple, right? So some of them I'm going to mention are the very same people that Metatron mentions and is so quick to accept prima facie, or on face value. So let's see if he would accept them prima facie as he did with the pro-Greek ones. So we have Strabo, Roman Greek historian. He says, the Thessalians in particular wore long robes, probably because they, of all Hellenes, of all Greeks, lived in the most northerly and coldest region. This is found in 11.14.12. As Macedonia is located north of Thessaly, it is obviously not part of Greece, whatever that is at that time, as we saw from Philip's answer to Flamininus. But we have another one saying by Quintus Curtius Rufus, a Roman historian. The Romans were the enemies of the Macedonians, so there are inconsistencies in their claims. That's intriguing. Talking about propaganda, but anyway, Quintus Curtius Rufus said, accordingly, one festive day, Alexander had a sumptuous banquet organized so that he could invite not only his principal friends among the Macedonians and Greeks, but also the enemy nobility. This was found on page 188. Here the Greeks and Macedonians are clearly separated. Justin, again another historic figure that Metatron mentions, a Roman historian, he said, it came to pass that during the absence of exertion on the part of the Greeks, the name of the Macedonians previously mean an obscure rose into notice. And Philip, who had been kept 3 years as a hostage at Thebes and had been imbued with the virtues of Epaminondas and Pelopidas, imposed power of Macedonia as a yoke of bondage upon the necks of Greece and Asia. Again, we have a clear distinction between territories, implying that Macedonia was distinct from Greece. Furthermore, we have Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian. I believe, again, Metatron mentions him as well, but this will be a much different Diodorus, so let's try to figure out why later on. Diodorus says, for even Greeks, Thespians, Plataeans, and Orchomenians, for even Greeks, and some other hostile to the Thebans who had joined the king of the Macedonians. So this, what was out of the ordinary here per this text, was that the Greeks as a whole joined Macedonian king. Alright, let's continue. We have Josephus, a Jewish Roman historian. He was employed by the Romans to write histories. Greeks, he says that Greeks and Macedonians that dwelt there. This was done in the Antiquities, Book of Antiquities, 13.511. Again, clear distinction between Greeks and Macedonians. And lastly, but not least, we have Diodorus again, Siculus, a Greek-Roman historian. The Macedonians and Alexander backed Coragus because he was one of them, while the Greeks favored Dioxippus. This was found on 17.100.4. Again, we have a clear distinction between Macedonians and Greeks. So, Metatron, what do we do with all these? With the explicit pro-Macedonian evidence in midst of the pro-Greek ones? It is very simple. When we see Roman or other sources, mainly historical enemies of the Macedonians themselves, not being able to agree between each other, we clearly see propaganda. Obviously, we should take them with a grain of salt, to say the least, especially if we say that we're diving deep into a subject. Right, Metatron? But you may say, well, we clearly see that they were mentioned as Greeks, Macedonians were. Indeed, Justin, a Roman, mentions them as such, but then Philip V was having a hard time understanding what Greece even was or where it was. But you would also say that there were some that weren't Romans, yet they claimed the same thing. The Macedonians were Greeks. Well, I guess you got me there, right? Or did you? Well, we go through the term Greek a lot, but we never really addressed it and explained it. We'll come to this after I explain some things concerning the mythological sources this channel mentioned, so stick with me. For Herodotus, Macedon was an offspring of Zeus or Zeus, and Thea or Dea, as we would say Macedonians. But then Metatron cites another confused historian, or whatever that next person cited may have been, that Macedon was a son of somebody else that was of Aetolian king, a Dorian tribe that was part of the 4 Hellenic tribes. Again, we have contradiction here. And when sources are cross-referenced with other pro-Macedonian sources, they really lose their weight. Nevertheless, the ancient Macedonian pantheon discovered in the middle text of the Rosetta Stone by the scientific discovery, mind you, scientific discovery of the 2 Macedonian academics, Aristotle Tentov and Tome Bushevsky, Ze, the god Ze, was the sun god, and Dea was the prime goddess. The feminine grammar is kept, just like in the modern Macedonian grammar there. So whether Herodotus was describing Macedonian or Hellenic pantheon originally, you be the judge, especially when he says that many of the Hellenic gods were introduced to the Hellenes by the Pelasgians, the natives. This was said in Herodotus, I believe, Histories 2.50.53. Metatron then continues to scan quickly on a couple of other ancients, stating that Macedonians were Hellenes. Alright, in one way or another, including Polybius, who, as Metatron stated, appeared that he didn't have any doubt of the Greekness of the Macedonians, even though I've showed you that the author cited a Macedonian king distancing himself, the author being Polybius, cited Macedonian king distancing himself from a Greek identity. In example, Philip V talking to the Roman Flamininus. Okay. Now, oh boy, we've got a lot to say. From the Persian I segment that Metatron did, he naively, or maybe just in purpose, because I think he's biased, he says that so far he was citing internal sources, meaning Greek sources, about the Greekness of Macedonians, including themselves, stating that they were Hellenes. But he never brought historical context into the picture, like who the Hellenes were. There were native people alongside the Hellenes, mentioned by the same sources he cited, calling them Pelasgians. Who on earth were they, Metatron? And just, he reads the sources and accepts them prima facie, like face value. That's not deep, right? That's pretty shallow if you ask me. But Metatron, he rarely turned on his critical thinking, and utilized philosophy to, when considering both sides, infer to the best logical explanation. Be that as it may, he continues with another section where he titles it as an external eye view, in a sense, meaning the Persian view. So he's presenting the Persian view on who the Macedonians were. Metatron, right from the get-go, concludes that the Persians thought the Macedonians were Greek. Per Darius I, the conquered populations were Scythians, Thracians, and no other than people called Iona, or Yauna, which transliterated would be Ionians. We agree on that. If Ionians were only one small part of the Hellenes, as Metatron would agree, I'm assuming per the sources he cited, what on earth could cause him to conclude that Iona was meant for the Macedonians? I mean, I get that Darius inscriptions kind of distinguish different people within the Ionas term, but what would now conclude you, make you, Metatron, to think that, yeah, okay, from now on, the Macedonians were Ionians, when in fact they themselves, per you and per other sources that you claim that are genuine, state that they were actually, Macedonians were actually Dorians. Yeah, for the life of me, I don't know, but So, if any one of you guys understand that and I missed something, please let me know in the comments. Now, the Persians did mention a people called Iona or Ionians that wore Macedonian type hats. Granted, they were talking about Macedonians. And just for clarification, I do think they talked about Macedonians in their texts as Ionians. It's just that I'm confused about the cognitive dissonance created by Metatron when stating Macedonians were Dorians earlier and not Ionians. Be that as it may, let me explain what I mean when I say I do believe the Persians were naming the Macedonians as Iona or Ionians. Persians, they grouped different ethnicities under one name as Scythians. We agree on that. They were very able, though, to distinguish between ethnicities, but for some reason they grouped the Scythians because they were a loose confederation of different ethnic peoples. The same goes for the Macedonians and the Hellenes then. The Persians grouped a couple of ethnicities, the Greeks and the Macedonians, because they were allies, or at least it looked like they were to the Persians. They also shared the land. The Macedonians, or the Pelasgians in other words, living in the southern Balkans, were ruled by Hellenes as tyrants. Hence, this part of the Balkan Peninsula knows about city-states, and Macedonia proper had a kingdom with long ruling dynasties, long before city-states even appeared there. I say Macedonians or Pelasgians because all over Macedonian lands you see Pelasgian toponyms like Pella, Peloponnese, Pelion, Pelasica in Republic of Macedonia, Pelagonia in Republic of Macedonia. We have Achilles' father, Peleus, Achilles himself being disobedient to a Hellenic tyrant, namely to Agamemnon, etc., etc. Ancient sources also have evidence that Pelasgians are a distinct people from the newcomers, the Hellenes. Pella is eerily similar to the Slavian word of Bela, which means white. And I say this because we have an ancient Paeonian or Upper Macedonian city called Bilazora. Bilazora in Slavian language dialects means white dawn. And it's supposedly in ancient Macedonia. Alright. Also, we Macedonians always call the Aegean Sea as White Sea, so on and so forth. Just a little, spice on that language category Metatron established as warranted. Nevertheless, when we take the newly scientific discovery of deciphering the middle text of the Rosetta Stone as ancient Macedonian Slavian language using the scientific method that gave birth to reproducible results like reading the 2 stones of Canopus, inscriptions in Macedonia, and other inscriptions in places like Kokino, which is 3000 BC, one of the 4 oldest astronomical observatories in the world, and also Vincha, a place that also contained the script, which is 6,000 years old, and other places. There we have the term Yunza. In other words, in the middle text of the Rosetta Stone, deciphered ancient Macedonian language, we have the term Yunza, used to refer to the Macedonians over and over again. We can conclude with ease that the Persians did use the term Yauna about the Macedonians, at least the ones with the specific hats, right? But also for the ones that were on their land, ruling parts of it, the Hellenic tyrants, and grouped them just as they grouped different ethnicities under the name of Scythians. This is the best logical explanation given that the different, apparently contradicting notions are in play here. Now, if you say, Metatron, that the newly deciphered work is a joke because nobody in academia or anybody else acknowledges it, be careful here not to appeal to authority for something that demands reasoning and not human authority, right? And for something that is a scientific discovery gained by using the scientific method. You can check it out, it's online. It's called Tracing the Script of and the Language of the Ancient Macedonians, made by Aristotle Tentov and Tomislav or Tome Borshevsky. You're better than this. I don't think you will appear to authority, Metatron. But if you choose to say so, it just could be the very beginning of the end for you as somewhat reliable source of historical information and as an advocate for reason and Socratic thinking. So just be mindful of that. Going back to the promise I gave to talk, let's say more deeply about who exactly the Hellenes were, let's start from the place Metatron totally avoided, the Danaus. Now, historians also mention the Hellenes under the name Danaos or Danaan or Danaus. And they do that not as a separate Hellenic tribe, but as to refer to the Greeks as a whole. We find this in the Latin maxim, "Don't trust the Danaans, even when they bring presents." Although you may know this as "Don't trust the Greeks, even when they bring presents." Also, Homer's Iliad, Danaans, tribe of Danaus, commonly this designate the Greek forces opposed to the Trojans. The summarized myth of Danaus consists of him fleeing Egypt with his 50 daughters and establishing a new dynasty in Argos, Hellas. after a dispute with his brother Aegyptus, the king of Egypt. Alright. His father, Danaus's father, was a person called Belus. Now, before coming to the Balkans, this family originated and were living in the Middle East. So we're talking about Semites, if you haven't noticed. One story that originated in that very same area is the story of Jacob's sons Dan. Now, he ran from his brother, who was Joseph, practically a king of Egypt in effect. His father wasn't named Belus, but his mother was named Bilhah. His descendants will be given a land by God, the Danites, a land that they will leave and start colonizing, like they did with the northern city of Dan that they established some 200 kilometers where they initially settled in the Promised Land. But also the biblical judge Deborah, whereas she ironically was asking what was the tribe of Dan still doing in the ships when his brothers were outside of the ships. This is found in Judges 5:17, I believe. Clearly, Dan, the tribe of Dan, the Danites, was restless and was colonizing. Now, the Hebrew alphabet pronunciation carries almost the same pronunciations as the Hellenic alphabet. This is very interesting because the mainstream believes that the person that brought the Balkanians the so-called Greek alphabet was a Phoenician in the 8th century called Cadmo. Given the similarities with the Hebrew one, it is not far-fetched to say that it was actually a Jew from the tribe of Dan that was responsible for introducing the Phoenician alphabet, which was phonetic, to the native Pelasgians in the Balkans. I mean, after all, to somebody that's all the way in the Balkans, would seem that that guy coming from Israel is coming from Phoenicia, which was a land, established long before the Israelites came into Canaan. Going by that theory, which is backed up also by the latest deciphering of the middle text of the Rosetta Stone as ancient Macedonian Slavian language, the ancient Hellenes, or the Danaans, were the ancient Hebrew tribe of Dan. They were mentioned, at least the ruling class was, or maybe took over. They were mentioned as Danaans in the middle text of the Rosetta Stone per the new deciphering, and always within the socio-religious context of the era the stone was built. Also, they were always referred to as what we now know as Hellenes. Their so-called Phoenician alphabet is actually Hebrew. If you compare the sounds between both alphabets, this would be pretty obvious. You got Aleph and then Alpha. You got Jewish Beth, you got Betha. You got Gimel, you got Gamma, etc., etc. Furthermore, in the second book of Maccabees, now listen to this. In the second book of Maccabees, a Spartan king writes to the Jewish high priest at that time to state that the Spartans have Abrahamic ancestry. Dan is one of is of Abrahamic descent, the tribe of Dan. Spartans had child sacrifices as well, just as Hebrew had in Canaan. To push on this a little bit further, the famous Minoa, the guy from Crete, called Minoa, that coincides with the time Deborah was actually complaining about the tribe of Dan being in the ships, alluding that they were colonizing, is very much a variation of the Hebrew person of Manoah, who was a father of Samson, the strongest man in Jewish history, a Jewish hero. These were also Danites, Manoah and Samson, from the tribe of Dan. Now, one also interesting fact is that ancient Jews had an incident with brave 300 men chosen by God. Even further, listen to this. Hesychius states, and Aristotle confirms, that the people called Eli and Seli, there were people that were called Eli and Seli, later known as Hellenes, came at Dodona, at Olympus, where they established the Olympic Games, and that they came from Egypt, carrying the rites of the Ark. Sorry, WinZip. What are we talking about here? What kind? The Ark of the Covenant. How can Egyptians? Well, they were coming from Egypt, but how can How can they carry the rites of an ark? Makes no sense. But they also carried stories of great flood. As mentioned, Aristotle states that they were called Eli, which even in modern Macedonian would mean those who belong to El. El is a Hebrew generic word for God. The term Seli, that Aristotle also mentions, has a meaning for someone that migrates even in modern Macedonian language. Not Greek one, but the modern Macedonian Slavian language. There were exceptions like Achilles or Ail, what we would say in ancient Macedonian etymology per the newly deciphered ancient Macedonian text of the middle text of the Rosetta Stone, which means Ail, which means first sunlight, and sunlight, Svetlina, in modern Macedonian is of feminine. Hence we got the letter A given at the end, because Macedonian was read from right to left. It was giving a feminine gender. This is why Achilles was so reluctant to partake under the command of Agamemnon, by the way, noted in the Iliad. Now, Agamemnon, you ready for this? Agamemnon is an Egyptian name with a Hebrew prefix. We have Aga, which is peer, a symbol of strength and longevity in Hebrew. And then we got Memnon, which is a classical ancient Egyptian name. Last but not least, Hellas, which refers for Greece, has only intelligible meaning under the Hebrew language. Not even Greeks know the etymological meaning of Hellas. Just as Boaz in Hebrew means in strength from bo, which is in, and az, which means strength, so does El-az means God's strength in Hebrew. You can thank me later. Having the generic Hebrew word for God, El, and Az for strength in it. We also have findings of the so-called Nile of the Delta knife, and you can all fact check me on these things, guys, but we also have findings of the so-called Nile Delta. Now, it's a knife, it's an artifact that's found in Greece, and other, like the classic warrior Egyptian helmets, they're found in Greece. What on earth are they doing there? Now, I think it's beyond a reasonable doubt that the Hellenes were the ancient Jewish tribe of Dan, especially if the Spartans themselves mention that. At least the rulers in the beginning were not, but I would say later on were taken over by the ancient Jewish tribe of Dan, because the appearing of the Phoenician script in the Balkans coincides with the Assyrian occupation of Israel, which would kind of logically follow that there were some Hebrew people that ran away from that occupation, so on and so forth. Now, if that is so, if it is beyond a reasonable doubt that the Hellenes were the ancient Jewish tribe of Dan, then this way, I will say that this created something like a Samaritan type of conglomerate in the Balkans, known as the Elii, or later known as Hellenes. This way, Macedonians and some Egyptians, we have records that some Egyptians participated in the Olympics. If they had Hebrew origin from their female lineage, Hebrew identity was and is established from the female side by their tradition, still is. This is a fact. This way, one could state that Macedonians had Hellenic, which means Hebrew in essence, roots by not neglecting their Gentile or Macedonian identity and vice versa, hence they could partake in the Olympics. You can thank me later. This would mean that the Hellenes would have been of Semitic origin. And as the ancient Jewish tribe of Dan, living in Egypt and Babylon and Assyria or Arcadia for centuries, they have accepted part of their language, which part of the Egyptian, part of the Babylonian languages, for which the Jews language, which was Semitic in nature. An example of this is the term for something bad, for which the Jews used the Egyptian word ra, and still use it till this day. It is well known in ancient times about the eagerness of the ancient Jews to adapt local customs and go even beyond in modification of those local customs that they encountered. Hence, when we break down the name Alexandru in Semitic, coming from the Hittite records for Alexander, we have Al, Semitic for God, Aksa, the farthest or the latest, Du, which from Akkadian it means to bring in or to create. So the Hellenic name Alexander, we have the original Macedonian name read in the middle text of the Rosetta Stone. I'll talk about that later. But the Hellenic name of Alexander, or Alexandru, is actually a Semitic name that means the latest created god. You following me so far? Now, the Macedonian name for Alexander, found in the recently deciphered middle text of the Rosetta Stone as ancient Macedonian Slavian language, had the same context. Naibogen, or the most divine, which is God, a god. Sorry about the, there you go. So we have the same context, which is in Macedonian, in ancient Macedonian, is the most divine, which would mean he is a god. We also find in the middle text, in the middle Macedonian text of the Rosetta Stone, that Naibogen, or Alexander, and other Macedonian rulers were compared as young created heavenly souls, which would completely coincide with the Hellenic Semitic meaning of Alexander, or Alexandru, the latest created god. So we have young created heavenly souls, Naibogeni, which would mean the latest created gods. This, I would say truth is stranger than 19th century romanticized propaganda. Don't you agree? If you don't agree, it would be insane, Metatron. Just saying, brother. Don't hate or love. Just saying, it's fine. But now, let's turn on the famous yet pathetic claim about the Pella cursed tablet. Again, I'm not claiming, I'm not hating. I really think the Pella argument, the Pella cursed tablet argument, is really something that nobody should go through when they talk about the Macedonian language. So we have in 1986, a year where a powerful Balkanian country called Yugoslavia was about to be destroyed by color revolutions and things already seen in our recent Macedonian history of our own Republic of Macedonia. The Pella curse tablet was excavated in 1986, but strangely, it was presented to the public in 1993, right about the year when Yugoslavia started separating. The war started, remember? Now, how convenient for the Greeks to present the Pella curse tablet at this time? Now, mind you, Yugoslavia was a federation of 6 republics, one of which was People's Republic of Macedonia. I think it's clear now why, the Greeks waited for so long to present something that even they had to infer things about, which we will briefly discuss. So it's not that plainly stated there that Macedonians were Greek or that's a Greek. Anything about Macedonian identity is not stated in that tablet. Namely, it contained a love curse, but it never contained even the slightest idea, implications about Macedonian identity at all. Now, I'm confused again how Metatron presents himself as a serious researcher but neglects this simple, straightforward fact. I guess he didn't have enough time to analyze or come to his own conclusions rather than just, he repeats Greek propaganda. It's like accepting without any doubt that because of any synagogues buildings you find in Greece, therefore you would conclude that the Greeks were Israelites. It doesn't follow. Or simply because you find, Ottoman Turkic inscriptions not inferring to any Greek identity within the inscriptions themselves, and therefore the Greeks were Turks. Now, if the claim that the Pella curse tablet was indeed written in ancient Macedonian was true, then mainstream would be the first to acknowledge that the font of the ancient Macedonian glosses, which is around 100-ish, in indefinite form and grammar, for that matter, had increased dramatically and would leave that fierce debate that they have that's happening amongst them to the side. It will leave it to be. It will be a done deal, They would have enough words, enough material to reconstruct the ancient Macedonian language, but they can't do that. Why? If the Pella curse tablet text is in ancient Macedonian. Have you ever asked yourself this simple question, Metatron? It's really simple. Now, this is not the case because often is the case where simple propaganda goes against what a scientific discovery or claim truly should be like. So that's why most of the people don't actually put to rest the debate between whether the 100-ish glosses that are found were actually Macedonian or not. This claim that Pella curse tablet contains Macedonian language, although it is really not backed by any evidence whatsoever, has to be one of the most pathetic attempts to align oneself with his or her own convictions. Please don't do that, Metatron. You're better than this, man. It has to be. Metatron mentions that a certain Greek historian and a certain linguist worked together to define Macedonian language as a peculiar Greek dialect. Now, I'm trying not to laugh at this point, to be honest, because what we have here is people working around a false premise, not being backed up by evidence or very poorly interpreted evidence, if you will. And from there, they just go on and create stuff with the first step as a flawed. I remain confused beyond explanation. If you guys understand it, let me know in the comments. I'll be more than happy to communicate with you and going back and forth around that one. But you need to help me out about this, Because of this type of science, I think because of this type of science that these two people did, working around established false premise and then building up from that, like the Pella curse tablet premise that it was Macedonian, Because of this type of science, we have the established notion of who the ancient Macedonians were, starting from the Enlightenment era, where we have the European nobility being poised by the romantic idea of Hellenism, learning about the Macedonians from mostly Roman sources, which, knowing the Romans, their propaganda is unmatched to this day. I mean, they were the Macedonians were the arch enemies of the Romans, and yet you believe the Romans without any filtering. You know, that's no bueno. So because of that, the Macedonian, we see the propaganda filtering itself out through inconsistencies in the Roman texts, like Philip V's incident with Flamininus, the trial of Philota, Demosthenes claiming Philip not only to be a barbarian, but also claiming he wasn't part of the Hellenic race. I am not aware of any claims about other Hellenic groups not being part of the Hellenic race. There are instances where others claim that other Hellenic groups were barbarian, but I don't know if anybody claimed that they were of Hellenic race. They were of Hellenic race. So we will touch on this a bit later. Metatron goes to say and easily accepts that Hellenes had natively had kingdoms and dynasties, like they had natively had this, that they originated from the Hellenes. This is not true, guys. The polis, or the city-state, was a natively Hellenic thing, and anything else was foreign to them. Saying it otherwise is to work around already established dogmas, just like those two people did with the Pelacurse tablet, and work around false and build upon false premises. Hence Metatron so easily accepts that the Athenians called the Macedonians foreigners, in effect simply because of political reasons. This would mean that the most archaic Greek traditions were non-Greek ones. See the cognitive dissonance there? As Metatron so eloquently stated himself, to think this is insane. Come on, guy. He connects the archaic traditions to the Mycenaeans or Mycenas and some Thracians, but let's see whether those archaic traditions were truly Greek. The most archaic Greek traditions, in the true sense of the word, concerning burial customs were that the deceased person was burned out. He was burned. The Pelasgo-Macedonians was that they were buried in mounds. So the Greek burned their dead. Macedonians buried their dead in mounds. This is an old Europe type of tradition, the Macedonian one connected to the earthly great mother goddess that we find also in the recently deciphered middle text of the Rosetta Stone as ancient Macedonian Slavian language, and even Maria Gimbutas also talked about this type of burial system by the old Europe type of peoples. Now, you find these types of mounts in all of Greece. Don't get me wrong, these were Pelasgo-Macedonian fingerprints, not Hellenic. We find a mountain Mycenae or Mycena where buried remains of people were never found, burned remains of people were never found in Mycena's mounts. Rather, full remains of people were with masks and so on and so forth. Whereas the Athenian tumulus, or mount at Marathon, and other Greek ones, were specifically for cremated soldiers. So there's that. This practice was entirely separate from all of the Hellenes together. Yeah, too many disappointments coming from Metatron at this point. You gotta Christian up, brother. You gotta speak out the truth. You gotta lean towards the truth. You gotta seek the truth. Now, Metatron then goes on to state some thoughts and historical claims about the first king of Macedonia called Karan and his son Temenus, which Even in modern Macedonian, it has an intelligible meaning, meaning dark, or temen. But briefly mentions that Alexander presents himself to the Persian ambassador as Hellenic governor of the Macedonians, and that he justified the support of a Hellenic coalition by being Hellene himself. I guess given all the historical inconsistencies, Metatron didn't find warranted again to dive a little deeper and present an alternative view of what this really means. Peter Green from Oxford wrote how Alexander's father, Philip II, even in his lifetime, had great difficulties convincing people to worship him as a god. Nevertheless, the will of being worshipped as such was present, and Alexander was witnessing all of that. That being said, our very own most logical explanation of what the term Hellas means, that we touched on briefly previously, a term prevailing by the newcomers, the Hellenes, or the Elii, coincides with Philip's and later Alexander's will, in a sense where if Hellas means land of God, strength, then people ruling that land were God's people or divine people. The very native Macedonian name that we find in the newly deciphered middle text of the Rosetta Stone as ancient Macedonian Slavian language was Naibojan. So this was a name used for Alexander, meaning the most divine one. Or, also in the text we find that the Macedonians referred to themselves as sacred animals, and the ones that were written in stone, meaning deified, they were eternal. Combined with the fact that Hezekiah stated that Hellenes came to Dodona and were called Eli, meaning belonging to El, the Hebrew generic word for God, one can easily conclude that Eli means God's people, from which Hellene later on became a synonym of a God children or God people. Hellene was initially a sacred title and not an ethnicity title. The Samaritan type of conglomerate that was created later on from Eli helped to Hellenes, helped tie this to a certain group of people that we now know as Hellenes. When Alexander claimed he was a child of Amun-Ra, the Egyptian god, nobody claimed that he was Egyptian. The same standard should be applied when he claimed he belonged to El, or he was a god's child. If we go by the mythical sources that mention Hellene or Helen as a son of so and so, we need to take into consideration the fact that we Macedonians, the prefix he, or from Hellenes, we pronounce it as e or as I, or e in Macedonian. Hence, from Herodotus we say Irodot. From Hellene we say Ilin. And the word il was actually found in the deciphered middle text of the Rosetta Stone in ancient Macedonian Slavian language, in the very historical context where it was found in Acadia, and that was the sunlight, meaning il, meaning the sunlight or the sun. In particular, in Macedonian meant the sunlight. We had a new word for sun, a different one. So, Ilini or Hellenes would mean a tribe that was present near Dodona at the moment of when the Elii, or later known as Hellenes, came from Egypt. Ilin would mean a person covered with sunlight. We also say Iracle from Heracles, or Hercules in Latin. Now this is interesting because the very own legends of Heracles or Hercules starts by him strangling a couple of snakes with his bare hands while he was a baby. Hence, also going by the etymological findings from the recently deciphered middle text of the Rosetta Stone, the letter I refers to something that is foremost or prime, and Rakle from Heracles, meaning hands. Ratse or rakle means hands. So next, Metatron shows the idea that, so there we have it, man. Complete coincidences, if you want to say there were, within the etymological meanings of Macedonian words. Interesting. Talking about language criteria, but let's move on. So next, Metatron shows the idea that because the judges that determine who entered the Olympics, judges, something like the biblical religious judges from the book of Judges, established that Alexander I, who was called Philhellene, mind you. Now you got to ask yourself why he was called that, if he was a Hellene in the first place, right? And he was allowed to enter the Olympics. As if he would have been stopped, if he wanted to lie and just gain political influence by bringing the judges or bribing the judges or something similar, or just attacking. Funny, Metatron doesn't take this political motive in the picture, but he was so easily convinced that the Athenians were politically motivated to call the Macedonians barbarians and people not of their race exclusively. Be that as it may, we've already explained how one could have claimed Hellenic identity, which was Hebrew in essence, and not neglect their Gentile identity that could have been approved to enter the Olympic Games. Mind you, Metatron also quickly noted that there were some judges that wanted to exclude Alexander the Philhellene because of being Macedonian. What is going on here? What's that all about? Now, Metatron goes on to state several historical figures without diving a little bit more, you ready? Deeply into their claims, accepting them at prima facie or face value. He mentioned that some figures that we presented here earlier, that have contradicting claims about the Macedonian identity. So again, what exactly is going on here? And for the life of me, I can't find where Socrates indicates that Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great, is a man of Greek blood. Socrates lived and died decades before Philip. I guess Metatron is satisfied with this claim simply because Socrates once stated that his ancestral homeland was Argos. Very poor logic here, if you ask me. We have other records like the communication between Philip V and Flamininus, where Philip V states that not all inhabitants of a certain city were Hellenes. In fact, he says that most of them were not Hellenes. I would say that this was the case even back in Argos. The Hellenes, as newcomers, were a minority people. Next, so talking about the ancestral land of the Macedonians, the Orestis, it was recognized so by none other than the judges for the Olympic Games, having Samaritan type of identity, also presumably being proud of their Hebrew origins in their own way. I think we have this settled by now, especially with the historical evidence in the second book of Maccabees, the Spartan king telling the Jewish high priest at that time that they, the Spartans, had Abrahamic descent. It's not surprising that these judges would state that Macedonians came from a place where the first Hellenes or Elii, the priests from Egypt, but not necessarily Egyptians, came from or came to. One can logically conclude that here the mingling of Pelasgo-Macedonians and these first Hellenes happened, creating the mix that could have participated in the Olympic Games. Metatron also states that the ethnicity of the ruling class of the Macedonians was the same as the people they governed, yet we have judges arguing amongst themselves that some Macedonians should not be allowed to participate in the Olympics. You know, Metatron, I think that he disappoints once more here. Sorry to say that. Now, the barbarian segment Metatron is talking about. Now, as far as calling the Macedonians barbarians by some of the Hellenes, Metatron aligns with some scholars that think or infer that this was simply done from a political motivation. Metatron states that Isocrates states that although he may have implied that Macedonians were Hellenes because of the ruling dynasties coming from the Argeads, he seems to be contradicting himself, the Isocrates, with saying that Macedonians had barbaric nature, meaning foreign nature. This goes directly against what Metatron accepts, and that is that the Macedonians were of the same kin as their ruling dynasties. Again, Metatron, excuse me for the commercials here, guys. This gotta stop. YouTube, how dare you? Now, Metatron mentions another historical figure stating that Ile or Archelaus in Koine was a barbarian or a foreigner. But finally, Metatron wants to look things in context because finally he noticed inconsistencies, or so it seems. It wouldn't take long, however, for Metatron to disappoint again because he mentions that Demosthenes claims that Philip was barbarian, but simply because of political reasons. You know, he fails to read the whole context of how Demosthenes talks about Philip. He talks about Philip as a foreigner, a barbarian, one who is not of the same race as the Hellenes. Why Metatron says he wants to go deep, but over and over again fails to do that is really confusing to me. Please let me know in the comments what am I missing here. If you know the answer for that, please let me know. The Macedonian elite made efforts to Hellenize their looks, but so did the Lydians, and so did the Romans, and so did the first century Jews, and so did many others. I remain additionally confused why Metatron is having trouble, or is having rather double standards here, and doesn't consider these, the Romans, the first century Jews, and the others, why he doesn't consider these as Hellenes as well. He seems to forget on purpose or not that Hellenes were the main trouble for Alexander himself. They often rose against him and against the Diadoi or the Diadochi, as mainstream knows them. On one occasion, they chased out Aristotle with the claims that he was rolling with the Macedonian bunch. And again, when Alexander presents himself as a world monarch in the mold of Achilles, let's not forget that Achilles, being a son of Persian that carried a Pelasgian, meaning non-Hellenic name, and disobedient to Agamemnon, was not a Hellene. As to the fact that he spread Hellenic language and culture, Metatron should have dived deeper. Again, and consider that he was spreading a lingua franca and kept the Macedonian language holy or separate for the Macedonians as to keep state and other secrets. For this motive, we have numerous historical evidence, starting with the trial of Philota, to the cries in Macedonian that Alexander did so that he wouldn't be understood by the Hellenes, and other evidences. In general, Metatron filters out things that, don't align with his already established notion of who the Macedonians were. Pretty sad to see coming from a guy like Metatron. Love you, brother, but I think you can do better here. he himself says that these historical figures imply that the other Hellenes were considered barbarians, particularly because of the way they spoke. But again, Metatron hides the important fact that some of the other Hellenes talked about the Macedonians as barbarians in the way they spoke, and barbarians because they were of different race. Finally, we come to the section where we talk about, the ancient Macedonian language in particular. Metatron mentions the fragments, which are the 100-ish glosses that are deemed as Macedonians' words, although there are debates in academia and elsewhere whether these were actually Macedonian words. And even though it is exceptionally hard to interpret historical sources about these glosses, nevertheless, mainstream deems them as ancient Macedonian. I would say because of romantic blindness, they do that. But hold on a second, I thought we have the Pella Curse tablet that was written in ancient Macedonian, so why do we still have this stock Metatron? The fact that we have ancient Macedonian writings in Hellenic is due to the fact that the lingua franca, the Hellenic language, Koine language, was used as simply that, as lingua franca. And although he clearly states historical sources, Metatron does, where clearly it was stated that Macedonians used different language that was unintelligible to all the Hellenes or all the ancient Greeks together, not just one, to all of them together. Metatron goes on to conclude, absolutely conclude, that Macedonians were Greeks, whatever that means, but regionally unique still. Fair enough, he has his opinion, I respect that, but that reduces from his credibility of presenting things or presenting himself as someone that objectively deals with certain subjects. He is very much in love with a romanticized idea from the Enlightenment era. Again, it's within his own, right to do that. In the meantime, we have to endure these videos like these and just keep pushing the alternative views the least, because layers of layers upon lies are being manufactured as scientific works simply because they are built on false premises or false presumptions. Metatron, I love you, man. We're both Christian fellas, but I really think you can do better and you can present things in a more objective manner, in a sense where just a small suggestion, you can do with your channel whatever you want, of course, but present things like, hey, this is one view, but this is the other view, and maybe just well, you already do that, which I acknowledge. You already say that this is my view of a certain subject, but you kind of scarcely present the other alternative views, which I get that you may not even, you don't have time to investigate, but I get that. But still, I'm here to correct some of those things. Love you, brother, and I hope you guys like this video. I will see you until the next one. Peace out.